Good evening, everyone, and we are here to learn the first chapter of Eicha of Lamentations together. Last week, we did an introduction, and now we are diving right into the book or the Megillah, the scroll. We talked last time about how usually we don't have written scrolls of Eicha. There are exceptions. The Vilna Gaon, the Gra, said you should read Eicha from a scroll. Of course, it's read every year in Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. And we talked just to remind us, you some important points, because we're going to be coming back to it in this class. So one of the things that kind of modern scholars have talked about are certain parallels we have between this lamentation and city lamentations from Sumer, kind of known lamentations from Sumer, which way predate Eicha. In other words, there's no way you could talk about direct influence from the Sumerian lamentations to Eicha, to Lamentations. There are also Babylonian lamentations, which are much further from Eicha. So in other words, the way they're closer historically, but they don't have the same parallels. Now the Sumerian lamentations have certain themes that we do see, and we'll see in this chapter of Eicha. The being sorry that the temple is desecrated, right? And strangers are trampling the temple. The idea of it in Sumerian lamentations, you have kind of a local goddess who's kind of bewailing the city, right? That she's lost the city. There's also in one of them, there's a reference to the people who have died inside the city from siege and outside the city from sword fight. So you have certain themes that you'll see in Eicha, and yet there's some very basic differences in the way these lamentations are composed and their purpose. So the Sumerian lamentations were apparently composed upon the rebuilding of that temple, either as a way of saying, isn't it great we're rebuilding it, or as a way of telling the god not to get angry because we have to clear this stuff away, but we're rebuilding. In other words, don't get angry at us. And now we're going to say this whole story of the destruction of the city and the temple, right? And also the whole way that story is told, first of all, it's told as a story. This is, and we're going to see with Eicha, it's an outpouring of grief. It's not a consecutive story in any way. There is no real way to follow a story of the destruction in Eicha and our Lamentations, whereas in the Sumerian Lamentations, it's a story. It's a story about the destruction, about how the local god goes to the council of gods and says, why are you doing this? And the council of gods like, hey, this is just the way it's got to be, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's another big difference, which is Eicha is written very much from a monotheistic standpoint, where this is our God is all powerful, so how could our God let this happen or do this, right? And the conclusion comes very quickly is, well, we sinned, and that's why. And that is what that's something that must that's the only way this works within the worldview encapsulated in Eicha, okay? There is no arbitrary council of gods. There is no local god who fights with them. There's just our God. And our God is angry, and our God did this to us, or let this happen. But frequently, but especially in this chapter, we'll see kind of an expression of God doing this to us. And how do we address this? What does this signify? Right now, we also mentioned last week that, so one of the questions is, okay, so then why that Eicha seems to be written? It seems to be composed of different lamentations, right? From slightly different points of view. And the question is, okay, so why were they written? If they weren't written like the Sumerian or even the Babylonian lamentations that are written for dedication of a temple, these are written when there isn't even a hope yet. Well, there's a hope, there's a prayer for reconstruction, but they're nowhere near, they're in exile. So why are these written? And of course, and I'm going to share my screen for this one. We talked about how in Zechariah, so this is in Shivat Zion, when they're coming back to Zion, right? You have a question that comes to them saying, shall I weep and practice abstinence in the 5th month? And specifically the fast of Av. Should we continue to do that when we're reconstructing the temple? And then there's a reference to Av, the fast of, right? And then the fast of Tishrei, which is Tzom Gedalia, right? Because if we think about, this is the thing. So a lot of times, I know my great uncle had a friend who was like, Gedalia wouldn't have fasted for me. I'm not fasting for him. But the fast of Gedalia is not fasting for Gedalia, right? The fast of Gedalia is fasting for the last gasp of hope that there was, that we could still reconstruct immediately after the destruction. Because the exiles with Yirmiyahu, with Jeremiah, had this leader, Gedalia, who had been kind of pro-Babylonian, who the Babylonians said, okay, he can be your leader. And there was a possibility that maybe they'd be able to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild. And after Gedalia was assassinated, that was, of course, no longer an option. And then God says later on in Zechariah 8, right? He says the fast of the 4th month, the fast of the 5th month, the fast of the 7th month, and the fast of the 10th month shall become occasions for joy and gladness. A 4th month being Tammuz. They were not fasting the 17th of Tammuz. That's from the Second Temple. They were fasting, I believe, the 9th of Tammuz. The fast for Av, whether it was happening 9th of Av, 10th of Av, whatever was happening exactly. The fast of Tzom Gedalia in Tishrei, and the fast of the 10th month of the 10th of Tevet, right? All of those fasts are happening because of the destruction of the temple in one way or another, all right? So if we have this whole set of fasts happening, and in general, a fast wouldn't just be a fast, people would gather and fast, and you have maybe confessions, there'd be kind of some kind of prayer, some kind of gathering and something happening with that fast. So it makes sense that these lamentations would have been written in order to be said during these public fasts. Okay, so that's something that makes sense. It's not something everyone agrees on, but it makes a lot of sense, particularly given that we know that what we call the Zitzin Leben, the purpose, the where this would function has to be different than these other ancient Near Eastern lamentations. So let's dive into the first chapter of Eicha. Any questions before we start? No. Okay, here we go. Okay. So this obviously not particularly cheery. Eicha yashva badad ha'ira bati'am hayta ka'almana rabati b'goyim sarati b'mdinot hayta lamas. Now I want to point something out to you. We talked a little bit in the last class about the Lamentations meter, right? There's an idea that Lamentations like 3 and 2, because it's like a ba-dum-bum, right? Like it's not where it's leaving us feeling unfulfilled and sad. However, a lot of Eicha does not have that meter. Okay, so here's an example. If we look, it's Eicha yashva badad, 3 words. Ha'ir rabati am, 3 words. Hayta ka'almana, 2 words. Rabati bogayim, 2 words. Sarati b'mdinot, 2 words. Hayta lamas, 2 words. In other words, it's most of our verses are still going to have that kind of parallelism. And when they don't, it's not always clear if it exists or not, because there are a lot of hyphenated words. We never know if those are 1 word or 2 words or how to count those. Okay. Eicha yashva badad ha'ir rabati am hayta ka'almana rabati b'goyim sarati b'mdinot hayta lamas. Okay. How the city who had so many people is now sitting lonely. She's now a widow who was great with people, right? And she who was a kind of a princess among these kind of city states has become mas. What is mas, right? Mas in modern Hebrew is a tax. The original meaning of mas was a person tax. The original use of the word mas was specifically for people who were taken as a tax, a labor tax, right? So we have, when Shlomo builds the temple, he does this a lot. He has people who are essentially taxed in terms of labor. The Babylonian and Assyrian empires did this a lot with particularly skilled workmen. When they would conquer a city or even take it as a vassal, they're like, okay, all your skilled workmen, we're taking them for our imperial projects. Okay, so that's the original meaning of the word mas. It goes from this kind of tax or vassal tax to be actual captives, captive workers. And then later on, when the idea becomes, I mean, you can pay your way out of it, or as a city, you can pay instead of having workers taken. So it becomes, once we get to rabbinic literature or the Book of Esther. The Book of Esther is the first place where we have a money tax, right? At the end, you know, Achashverosh places a tax. It's a money tax, and then it becomes money, right? But in its initial meaning, it is human beings. So it's not, and we have this verse is kind of leading it. She's not just lonely, but now her people, and she herself, we're talking about Zion, right? Zion, Jerusalem. She herself has become like one of these kind of taken, captive workers. And that means that all these people have become captive workers is really what it means. And this chapter in general is going to focus on the city, the pain of the city. It's not ignoring the individuals inside, but the city herself as a woman. And she's described as a woman. By the way, there's this desire to find parallels between Bat Zion, the daughter of Zion, and these mourning goddesses, right? In the other city Lamentations. The thing with the mourning goddesses is they're never called the daughter of the city. They're always called lady, woman. That's what they're called. They're not called what this is. This is frankly a traditional way biblically to talk about a city. You have Bat Edom, you have here you have Bat Zion, right? You have Bat Ami, right? The daughter of my people, right? The idea of Zion as a woman and a daughter and it fits with the theme of mourning, right? Which is frequently seen, something that women are particularly able to do. And also raises pity in others around, and empathy. She cries at night. She either cries at night because she's still crying from the day, or because she's alone, and that's when you cry, right? Her tears are on her cheeks. Why? Because she has no one to comfort her. She had all these friends, right? She had all these other nations who were supposed to help her. Or she had all these neighboring nations. It's not clear here. It's almost certainly we're talking about nations, right? Oops, what's going on here? So, it's almost certainly that it's talking about nations. Is it talking about nations, allies who didn't come to her aid, particularly Egypt, right? Or is it talking more about Egypt or Syria, right? Or is it talking more about the surrounding nations, Ammon, Moab, Edom, who celebrated and helped out when Jerusalem fell? So all her friends have betrayed her. They became enemies for her. Just the way it's talking about it, I would tend to say it's talking about the neighboring nations, because there is a very strong idea, and you see it when, like in Ovadia, when it talks about Edom, right? This idea that we're related, right? There's this tradition of being related to Ammon, Moab, Edom, we're related, and they didn't help. On the contrary, and there's reason to believe it is possibly referenced in Ovadia, that Obadiah, right? That Edom actually would catch people escaping southwards and hand them over, right? So, that kind of betrayal is very fresh. I see there's a question here. See? Oh, yes, so Susan's talking about Ir Va'em, Ir Uvunoteha. That's a little bit different. That's a way about talking about cities. Yeah, it's the idea of talking about a city as female, but without just because everything's gendered in Hebrew, right? So there is, it's again, biblically frequently cities are female, yes, but also calling it a daughter of is more anthropomorphic. Danny and Libby are asking, do I think the use of the term Eicha is an intentional reference to Isaiah 121? I don't, let me look. Maybe I don't, honestly, I think that, I'll tell you why I don't want to say that. I tell you why I don't want to, and it does seem to echo. I don't want to say that because the point of this opening seems to be to arouse pity for Jerusalem. So if we read how she become a harlot, right? The city that was once faithful, we haven't gotten to that point yet. We're going to talk about the sins later, but that's not what we want to start with. We want to start with, look at this beautiful city and how it's fallen. And it's true, I understand why someone would want to say that. And it does kind of echo, right? The Eicha, but the Eicha.
I was just thinking that the Eicha speaks about the process of how this wonderful city goes and becomes sinful, and it's like the open. Well, here's the result.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that the use of the word Eicha in this way, right, is this poetic kind of opening. How did this happen? Is parallel, and I could absolutely see if someone argued saying, I don't see how this could not be an echo. I just find it, for me, the whole point of this chapter of Eicha is to be sad, to feel bad for the city. If you start with saying, oh, well, the city's a harlot, then, you know, what are you feeling bad about? So I think that this verse is still, oh my goodness, she was a beautiful city. She was filled with people. And now they're all captives, and she's just crying, and she's been betrayed. And that's, again, also that question of Mikol Ohaveha, from all her lovers or friends. Is that a hint to the whole idea that she had lovers, that she betrayed God with lovers? Is that a hint to that, right? And kind of moving up to that point of saying, oh, now we know why. We know why they betrayed her, because she was betraying God by having that. In the prophets, in general, the idea that Jerusalem, that Yehuda formed these alliances with other powers is considered almost idolatrous, if not idolatrous. It's considered a betrayal of God when they form these treaties with these big powers. In Eicha here, it doesn't seem to have. It's not pushing it, put it that way. It's not, we can discuss it later because it just talk about this a little, it hints at the sins. So we can say, could that be the sin? You know, so it's a question. Galta Yehuda me'oni umerov avodah. Now the me here, so Yehuda has gone into exile. Here it's translating it as because of. It's really not necessarily because of. It is how Rashi interprets it. I think we also Kara interprets it differently. It's so there are different ways of interpreting it. What it probably means is it went into an exile in a state of torment and harsh work. Oni here probably doesn't mean poverty, it probably means torment. It's actually kind of parallel to the description of Egypt, of the slavery in Egypt. Hi yashva goyim lo matza manoach kol rodfeha hisigua ben hamitzarim. Right, she was dwelling. She is now dwelling among the nations, and she has no rest. Everyone who pursued her caught her, right, in the narrow places. Right. So what is now? This is also the narrow places. What are the narrow places? So it's possibly where they were escaping to. So for example, like Edom kind of caught them, the main road was kind of going through Edom. It's possible that it's actually referring to the escapees being caught when they were trying to run from the destruction and from the capture. And here I want to point out, we have in this chapter a lot of parallels to Deuteronomy, specifically 2 places, and you kind of know what it's going to be. Right. So we have We have the curses in chapter 28, Perek Chet, right? And we have Hazinu, right? The song with the harsh prophecy in chapter 32. So in this chapter, there are places where there are absolutely parallels. This is one of them. Here we have in Dvarim Chet Samech Hey, so that's 28:65. Uvagayim hahem lo targia, right? This is a clear reference, right? Because it's talking about her living among the nations, right? Even among those nations, you will not have any peace. Lo targia. You will not have any rest for your feet, right? Then you can see here, right? So there's already a hint that what befell Jerusalem is what was promised, is a punishment. If you don't do right, this is what's going to happen. Also, of course, Kol Rodfeh Hisiguha is also, I'll hear Kol Rodfeh Hisiguha, all her pursuers caught her, right? Is also parallel here to Chafchet 28. Hold on. There we go. Here. Verse 45. Here we are, right? When all these curses befall you, and they will pursue you and they shall overtake you until you are destroyed, right? So we're already seeing the hint in these verses that what befell her was what was coming to her. We're still expressing the pain, but we already have the hints here, okay? You can kind of understand why some think that chapters 2 and 4 were written before chapter 1, because chapter 1 seems more like a little because it's a little bit more already saying, okay, it's already embedded in it are the reasons for this happening. Also, chapter 1 is the only one that has the alphabet. Well, you know what? We'll get when we get to the verse. We'll talk about it. The order of the alphabet in chapter 1 is different from the order of the alphabet in chapters 2 and 4. Actually, Qumran fixes chapter 1, the order in chapter 1, to match the order of the alphabet in chapters 2 and 4. Yes. So here we go. I'll speed up a little. I wanted to point out she's crying. She's got tears on her cheeks. Why? Because she has no one to comfort her and wipe them away, right? It's not just, it's a double thing. She's crying so much, she has tears on her cheeks, and she has no friends. They've all abandoned her. Okay, and that's a double misery. That's a double pain. All right. They've gone into exile, and even in exile, they have no rest. And again, we saw how this is supposed to be the culmination of the curse in Dvarim, right? This is the fulfillment, rather, of the curse in Dvarim, in Deuteronomy. Darchei Tzion avelot mibli ba'em moed, kol she'areh shomemin kohaneha nenachim v'duoteh nugot v'hi marla. So Tzion's roads are in mourning. Why are they in mourning? Because there's no one there. No people are coming in order to celebrate at the temple. All her gates are desolate, meaning everyone gathers at the gates. That's where that's where people buy and sell things. It's where people do legal contracts. It's where people go to court. All the things are happening at the gates, but there's no one there, right? Her priests are sighing. Why? Because there's nothing for them to do, and there's also no food for them to eat because no one's bringing sacrifices. Bituloteha, and I want to note, bitulot are not virgins, they're young women. Okay, the Betula doesn't have to be a virgin, it's a young woman. This isn't, by the way, this is not in any way connected to kind of the Christian interpretation and Mary the Virgin, because that's based on a verse that says Alma. It doesn't even use the word Betula, it uses the word Alma, and Alma is never the word for virgin. So it doesn't matter. But regardless, the word Betula is not just a virgin. Okay, it means her young women. Okay, her young women are nugot, they're unhappy. Nugot here is from Yagon. Okay, Yagon is woe, misery. Her maidens are filled with misery and woe, and she is bitter and unhappy. Her hayut sareha lerosh oiveh shalu, that's also a reference to the curses. Hayut sareha lerosh, that her her enemies were for a head. That's in the curses as well. He will be a head and you will be the tail, right? Oiveha shalu, her enemies are at peace. Like you should be at peace. Zion should be at peace. But no, her enemies are now at the top and they're at peace. Hashem hoga al rov psha'eha, because God is causing misery. Again, it's also from Yagon. Hoga is causing misery because of all of her sins. Now, this is, here we're in verse 5. This is the first time we get this explanation. Why is this coming to her? Because of her sins. We saw all the hints moving up to this point. All right. We don't know what the sins are yet. Her young babies, her infants have gone into slavery, have gone into captivity before the end. Okay, and we know this, they did in fact take children as captives, of course, women as captives. And this is what's interesting to me in terms of the way this kind of verse is structured is it kind of says, oh yeah, because God's punishing us for our sins. It's totally not the topic of the sentence. You don't come away from the sentence thinking, oh yeah, Jerusalem sinned, unless you're really paying attention. It's like, yeah, her enemies are on top and her little babies are taken into captivity, and kind of sandwiched in between is she sin, right? Because God is punishing her for a sin. But from here, okay, we're going to have that opening that this is from God. Okay. All her glory has gone out from the daughter of Zion, from the city. What is all her glory? All her glory are the important people, right? The officers, the priests, all the important people. Those are her glory, and they have been driven out in captivity. Her officer, her leaders are like stags that have not found pasture. This, by the way, they do have. They have it in a curse. They found it in I think a Babylonian curse. It may have been a Syrian curse. They said you should be like a stag that doesn't have pasture. And they walked without strength before the pursuer. What does this metaphor mean? Normally, they would be very fast, but they had no strength, and so they were easily caught, right? And this is the thing, the leaders who should have strength, who should have been able to prevail, they didn't. And so they were caught, even though, if you've seen, Ayalim, they're beautiful, right? They're beautiful. And I think that's why you have this imagery in ancient Near Eastern things, is that the idea that you have this beautiful thing that can go fast and is brought down in shame, right? Zachra Yerushalayim yimei onya umerudeha kol machamudeha asher hayu mimei kedem binfo ama biyatzar ve'en ozer la ra'uhat sarim sachaku al mishpateha. So Jerusalem remembers during the days of her kind of her torment and her sorrow, she remembers all the lovely things she had in the days of old. And at the time, she remembers this at the time when her nation is falling in the hand of the enemy and no one's helping her. And not only that, all the enemies are laughing at her crisis, at her downfall. And that's also a theme. It isn't enough that you're defeating me, but you're laughing at me and everyone around. Not only are they not helping me, but they're laughing. And that becomes a theme. I want to point something out here. We're talking about Jerusalem, 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 Jerusalem. We're not talking a lot about the temple. We are going to have more references to the temple, right? But we're talking about Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. It's very clear this is about Jerusalem. We sometimes forget how important the city Jerusalem is in Jewish thought, in biblical thought, and then in Jewish thought. It's not just the temple, it's Jerusalem. And those of you who learned Ezra and Nehemiah with me know that I've talked about how one of the themes of that book is not rebuilding the temple. They do that pretty quick early on and easily. Rather, it is building Jerusalem. That becomes Nehemiah's big goal. And that's the thing that's difficult to do, is rebuilding Jerusalem and reestablishing it as kind of a capital city. That's all important to Nehemiah. right? And we can see here that Jerusalem is all important. They're talking about Jerusalem. It's not just the temple. It's not all about the temple, right? It's Jerusalem. Okay, so, and now we're going to talk more about the sin, right? Now we have now it's clear that our subject is the sin. We're explaining now what happened. Right? Jerusalem sinned. It could even be in the Qumran version of Eicha. It's Jerusalem surely sinned, not just Jerusalem sinned to sin. It's Jerusalem surely sinned. Chato chata is in Qumran. So it's chato chata, where both of them are verbs, right? Which means Jerusalem surely sinned. And therefore she was, in the word nida here, akenla nida hayata doesn't mean nida as in a menstruating woman. That is going to be used later on. Here it means either someone that everyone kind of nods their heads at in kind of in sorrow or in looking at something terrible, or it means someone who's a wanderer. Okay, that's what the phrase here. It's hinting to the menstruating woman later, right? But here that's not what it means. Everyone who used to honor her now thinks lightly of her because they saw her nakedness. Now, this is connected to the sin because there's an idea that have this as biblical law. We see this reflected a lot in the prophets, et cetera, that there's a general practice. A woman who sins is stripped naked kind of in the public square, right? Usually in general, a sin of adultery or perhaps being a witch, right? So this is what it's saying. She sinned, and now, so it's all connected. The sin and the punishment are connected and together are the source of her great shame, like a woman who has been convicted of her sin, right? She also sighed and sat back. In other words, she also is ashamed. It's not just that other people, that she lied in other people's eyes, that other people find her shameful. She finds herself shameful and she sits back. Okay, why? Because she recognizes her sin. She recognizes not only her horrible destruction, but her sin that caused it. And these together are part of her shame, which makes her herself ashamed of herself. And now we're getting more into, and this is the question. So there are two ways to read this, right? Her uncleanness is on her skirts. And let's stop with this. Her uncleanness on her skirts. This is very much like reminds us of the passage in Yirmiyahu and Jeremiah with a woman, a menstruating woman, where the menstrual blood is on her skirts, right? And of course that's shameful and whatever and kind of disgusting. Rabbi Yosef Kara actually thinks that shuleha is a euphemism, and that what it's saying is that her private parts have been defiled because she was guilty of adultery, right? Why is she guilty of adultery? That would be the treaties with foreign nations, right? So that would be, that would be a reference to that as a sin. Lo zachra acharita, that means when she did not think of what was going to happen in the future. Because remember when we were saying how this was all foretold. We had hints in the first part of the chapter. This is all foretold. This is all kind of the coming true of the curses. And in fact, there are more and more references to the curses and to Hazinu. But when Jerusalem was sinning, she didn't think of what was going to happen because of her sin, right? And she fell catastrophically with no one to comfort her. Now she speaks. She says, God, see my torment because the enemy has grown kind of over me. And this is and so from this grief and from her shame, notice that the fact that she sinned just makes it worse, right? fact that this is because of her sin just makes her shame worse. It just makes the situation worse. And she's saying to God, but see my misery, because again, what this seems to hint at or say, right, is okay, I sinned, but look how tormented I am. And look how the enemy is kind of looking down at me and saying, hey, I'm great, I'm wonderful. I mean, this is a kind of a repeating theme in many biblical situations, right? Where, okay, God, forgive me because the enemy thinks it's all his power, right? So get the enemy because the enemy is taking credit and thinks he's defeated you, right? So this is kind of a hint to that, like, look at my torment. And also the enemy is saying, oh, look what I conquered. Yado paras tsar al kol machmadeha. Now here we're getting to the temple. Yado paras tsar al kol machmadeha. The enemy has spread his hands on all of its treasures, all of the temple's treasures, and that's what they did. They looted the treasury. Kirata goyim ba'u mikdasha asher tzivita lo yavo b'kahalach. Okay, so and she saw Jerusalem had to watch as these nations came into her temple, who you, God, commanded that they should not come into your community, right? Into it. It's not clear if it means your God's community or her Zion's community. Is this a reference to, and where we are used to this phrase is the idea that Ammon and Moab, right, can't join the people of Israel, right? And here it's not clear, is it saying this is Ammon, it's Ammon, and it's like Ammon and Moab, or they are Ammon and Moab, and they're not even allowed to convert, they're not even allowed to join the Jewish people, and they're stepping into your temple? Or is it simply saying you're commanded that they can't come where we gather? They can't come into the temple, and here they are just trampling through it. I see there's a question. Susan says the idea that menstrual blood is shameful and disgusting is a male perspective. I'll tell you the truth. I think that most women don't want to walk around with menstrual blood on their skirts and would be embarrassed if you said to them, excuse me, you've got menstrual blood on your skirts. And women will take very strong steps to avoid that, if at all possible. So I think in general, it's not just, we're going to get to this later, actually. Part of being a menstruating woman in biblical thought means that men have to stay away from you, right? That meaning is used later on, okay? In other words, the idea that you're menstruating woman and therefore they're staying away, right? In this case, I feel like most people would find, just instinctively would say, you know what, this is a very unpleasant situation. But again, Rav Yosef Kara doesn't see it that way. He doesn't think that verse is talking about menstruating blood at all. He thinks it's talking about that she was impure with herself. Okay, so back to and Danny and Libby ask, what is the objection to treaties with other nations? Did Yehuda always have treaties with the neighboring states? There's a theme in prophecy that you shouldn't have these treaties with these large, well, first of all, frequently treaties with empires or treaties when you were a vassal state meant you were trying to kind of rebel and you were going to join with this vassal. You were relying on this other nation. There's this idea that you're relying on this other nation more than you rely on God. So you'll see it with so for example, and this isn't Yehuda, this is Israel, but Hosea gets very upset that they're saying, oh, are we going to ally with Egypt? Are we going to ally with Assyria? What should we do? Right? He thinks that this is tremendously unfaithful to God. And part of this, of course, latches into this idea that it's hard to know the extent to which it's true, but there used to be this idea that prophecy was a reaction to these empires. That with the rise of empire, you needed the rise of prophecy, because what the empire seemed to be saying was, if this empire is ascendant, that means their God is ascendant, and the prophets had to say, no, that's not the way it is. So it does seem to, it might be kind of at least a little connected with that, right? That the idea that that you can't that you're not relying on God and you're relying on these other people who they believe that they're God's best, right? But I think it's much more just not. I don't think that Hosea like says, oh, don't believe in like their God. I think he has a problem with Baal, obviously, and other things like that. But he does have problems with that, but that's not necessarily related to empire. And there is an idea that just allying with an empire. And then there are all other times when prophets are like Yirmiyahu, like Jeremiah, where he's actually kind of almost acting like a political advisor, saying, guys, this alliance with Egypt, it's not going to help. Just suck it up and serve Babylon, right? And that's also something. Yeah. Yes.
In Yeshayahu, there's a specific reference to a kaneratzutz that in your
yeah. Yes, right, exactly. It's a reed that you cannot rely on clearly, and that would be kind of an Egypt reference, right? That it's you can't, don't put your trust in Egypt. And the fact is, it was a mistake for them to put their trust in Egypt. Egypt did it in the beginning, seemed to come to their aid, but then ran away. And that was one of the things that did in fact lead to their downfall. Okay, so back to our verses. So now we have the idea that not only that, but the temple itself has been looted and overrun. And now we have a slight description of the siege, right? Kol aman enachim mevakshim lechem, natnu machamadeihem ba'ochel lashiv nefesh. All of her people are sighing and asking for bread, right? Or for really, sometimes it's lechem is just used for any food, right? They're giving all their treasures for food in order to keep alive. Re'eh Hashem v'abita ki hayiti zolela. Right? So look, God, at how cheapened I've become. That this is what the people who are, these higher people are not just giving anything away just to have food to eat. Lo alechem kol ovrei derech habitu u'r'u im yesh machov machovi. And this is not clear. It's not clear what lo. It's not lo alechem is a little bit of a problem. If we just translate it the way it's written, it's like, oh, this shouldn't happen to you, all you travelers. But it seems to be. Maybe that's not the original meaning. Anyway, so may it not befall you, all you travelers. Look and see if there's any pain like mine. Asher olali, asher hoga Hashem b'yom charonapo. That he did to me, that God caused me this woe on the day of his anger. Now, the day of his anger, the day of his wrath, that's also a reference to Yom Hashem, to the day of God, right? There's this general idea there's going to be a day of God. And on that day, God is going to take vengeance against his enemies being Israel's enemies, right? But this day of wrath was not like that. God hit me. God hurt me, right? And there's absolutely there's this sadness and anger. God himself did this to me, right? And we can say this now because we've already set it up very clearly that it's because Jerusalem sinned. So we can say, God did this to me. Like, we know why. Right? But God really hurt me. God really destroyed me here. And here we're going to go into more details. Mimarom shalach esh basvotai vayerdena, paras reshet l'raglai hashivani achor, netanani shomema kol hayom dava. From above, he sent a fire in my bones, right? And he controlled them or went down, like possibly in Qumran, I think it actually says he went down. But anyway, he trampled them. He spread a net for my feet and he pulled me backwards. In other words, he trapped me, right? He threw fire down from on high and he trapped me with a net, right? Nitanani shomema, he made me desolate, and all day I'm in misery. All day in misery. Niskad o psha'ai. Niskad here is actually the only, we don't even know what niskad means here. Even with cognates, we don't really have a meaning for it, but you can take it from the context. Niskad o psha'ai biyado, Okay, God somehow God put on me or pulled together the yoke of my offenses in his hand. Yistargu, they knit together. Alu al tzavari, it went on my neck. Hikshil kochi, it took away my strength. Nitanani Adonai bidei lo uchal klum. God gave me into the hands of someone I could not stand up in front of. God gave me into the enemy's hands. So this verse shows how the sin and the punishment are completely interwoven. God took the yoke of my sin and he put it on me. It's woven on me. It brought me down and I fell before the enemy. Okay. Again, and this is something I talk about a lot, the idea that sin is an actual thing. The idea that sin is not just some kind of floaty thing that I can get rid of, I can wipe it off like I wipe off a whiteboard. It brings you down. The day's got to come. Payment's got to happen, right? And this is what the sin itself brought me down, because sin itself has weight, okay? And it brought me down.
Miriam?
Yes.
The word niskad, I never heard it. Maybe it's mistaken. It's a ne'ekad.
Yeah. So I think that a lot of times it's translated. I think they want to say it's nishkad. I didn't see it was interesting because I was looking at Yaakov Klein's book on Eicha, and he actually didn't have a particular suggestion. He was just like, okay, just use context clues. I think ne'ekad is a little weird for a yoke, right? Because I guess you could do it. I'm not sure if you would use that verb for like tying up the ends of the yoke, right? So I mean, because yeah, you can have a sin turn to an ayin. But I haven't seen that suggestion. But I think it would depend on whether you could use that word for a yoke, right? And so yeah, so that's a question. And I'm just going to get to the end of this passage, and I'll pause for any more questions before we continue. Silach kol, I see we don't have a lot of time. We'll get through it, don't worry. Silach kol abirai, Silach kol abirai Adonai b'kirbi, kara alai moed l'shpor b'chorai, gam darach Adonai l'vtulat bat Yehuda. Okay, at this point, we're not even pretending that God is not acting like the enemy, okay? So there's been a kind of a progression, right? We had this recognition of sin, and that sin brings us, we're ashamed of the sin. That's why it's happened, or the city's ashamed of sin. That's why this is happening. It's not happening for nothing. The sin itself brought us down, right? And God himself is acting like the enemy. And now we're like, God has put down all of my heroes in my midst. He set a date to break my young men. He tread on the young woman, the daughter of Yehuda, like in a winepress. God's mashing us up, right? And he set a date for it to mash us up. This is what I'm crying about. My eyes are flowing with water. I have no one to comfort and to bring my breath back, my life back, to bring comfort to me. Right? My sons are desolate because the enemy has overcome. Right? Persat Sion biadeha, and now we're gonna, there's a transition, right? We go to third person. Okay, so I'm just gonna go to third person, and I'll take some questions. Persat Sion, so that our speaker. Okay, so this was Zion speaking, Sion speaking, and now he's saying Persat Sion biadeha en menachemla, right? Zion spread out her hands in beseeching, right? But she has no one to comfort her. Tiva Hashem li'Yaakov sivav tzarav. God has summoned the enemies around Jacob. Now here remember when I said we're going to talk about a menstruating woman as with a different meaning. So Jerusalem is a menstruating woman among them, meaning she has no one to comfort her. Everyone's staying away, right? Except her enemies came around her. They're there, right? They're going to attack her, but she is like a menstruating woman that no one is going to come close to her to comfort her. That is what happens to a menstruating woman, right? No man is going to come close to her to comfort her because she's menstruating, right? So in that case, that is the state of Jerusalem. She has on the one hand all the enemies gathered around her, right? And on the other, she has no one to comfort her. Okay, now I'm going to take some questions. I see there are some. So Chano says, why a little Lamed? Yes. So why a little Lamed? So that whole let me find the verse. Hold on here. The Lo Alechem. So that's one of the reasons why people think this was maybe not the original. A lot of times when you have a little Lamed like that, it's because someone put it in because they were trying to correct it. Like maybe they had the Vav and the Aleph and they're like, what could be here? Or someone wrote it in the margin and then they put it in. It's usually an indication that there's something weird about that word that people weren't sure how to deal with. Remember that our scribes are generally, especially in the Masoretic tradition and our tradition, of what we got, the Bible that we got, they're fairly conservative. So if they have something, they're not just going to erase it. But they might mark it, right? As a way of like, this, I'm not sure about this. I saw this in one manuscript, I didn't see the other manuscript, right? That's where we get kriyuchti from, the thing of where we read one thing and something else is written. And we have that a lot in this chapter, actually, or we have it a few times in this chapter. So that's something that indicates that word's problematic. And the fact is the meaning of the phrase as written is a little bit weird because it's not like, and the chapters of Eicha to say, oh, all these people who are passing by and seeing Jerusalem, this thing shouldn't happen to you, right? It's not kind of in the tenor of what a lot of Eicha is about, because a lot of times it's like, whoever did this to us, they should have the same thing happen to them. So that's why it's a little strange. You can see it because they're just passers by maybe, but it seems like something else may be going on there. And Susan said maybe Shin Kuf Dalid, as in Jeremiah 12-13. I'm not sure what you're referring to, so I can't. Shin Kuf. Oh, it's Shakad. Yeah, well, that's the way people want to read it, and I shouldn't say people want to read it. Traditionally, some have read it that way with a Shin Kuf Dalid Shakad. In other words, as opposed to that God kind of determined was set, set and put the yoke, but it doesn't seem to be that. It seems to be a sin, right? And just so you know, linguistically, a sin and a shin are not the same letter. Linguistically, they're two completely different letters. Just so you know. The fact is that we were using an alphabet that only had one letter for that. And we're just like, okay, well, it's fine. We'll know it's different. But linguistically, they're two completely different letters. So we had a kind of a break where he said, okay, this is the state of Zion. All right. Now we're going to have a switch to kind of a moral of this little story, like a kind of a closing, right? So we had all this outpouring of Zion. God seems like an enemy. Okay, it's a punishment. I sinned, but this means that God has just been like crushing me. Okay. And we have to say, okay, yes, Sion spreads out her hands and she has no one to comfort her. Okay. And now we have a return to the city, to Zion. Tzadikhu Adonai kifihu mariti shim'una chol ha'amim ur'u machovi b'tulotai u'bachorai halchu b'shevi. God is in the right? Frequently we tend to want to translate tzaddik as righteous, but frequently what it means is that in a court of law, he is the right one. God is the correct party here. Okay, God is the one in the right. All right, because I disobeyed him. I disobeyed what he told me to do. Listen, all the nations, and see my pain, my young women and my young men have gone into a captivity. Karati lamahavai hemarimuni. I called out to my friends or my lovers, and they betrayed me. Again, these probably, in this case, probably allies. It could also be the surrounding nations like Ammon, Moab, Edom, but here probably allies. Kohanai uskenai ba'ir gava'u, ki bikshu ochel lamo v'yashivu et nafshem. My high class people, my priests and my elders, who are usually the people who are fairly wealthy, they died in the city because they needed food in order to stay alive. Re'eh Adonai kitzarli me'aycha marmaro nepach libi b'kirbi ki maro mariti michutz shikla cherev b'bayit hamavet. So see, God, the distress I'm in, that my insides are in turmoil, and my heart is turned within me. Because, and I wonder here if it's just not my heart is in anguish, or because a lot of times when it says heart, what it means is mind, right? My mind is in anguish, right? Because I surely disobeyed, okay? Because I disobeyed. From outside, probably either from outside the city, or there were battles inside. Yirmiyahu also mentions like battles in the city itself. So either outside the city or from people are fighting inside the city, but outside the buildings, right? But from outside, people were killed by sword, and inside in the house, it's like death, right? This says endorse the plague. Actually, there's an idea that this mavet here is actually referring to an Akkadian word for plague, possibly. Here, let me see if I can find it. So here I'm in Hazinu, which is, of course, is the prophecy of what happens when you betray God, right? And which you will inevitably do according to Hazinu. And here we have exactly this is, and it's very clear here that this is referring to this verse. Michutz tishakel cherev u'michadarim ema. Outside, the sword will kill people, and inside in the rooms is terror. So compare that with what we have here. Same words, michutz shikla cherev, right? Outside, using the same verb, the sword kills, and in the house is like death instead of terror. So again, this is a very clear thing. This is what was prophesied by the song that Moshe sang, right? And now it's happening. Okay. Sham'u ki ne'anacha ani en menachem li kol evad shamura ati sasu ki ata sita heveta yom karata v'yu chamoni. Now we're switching to what Jerusalem wants, right? They heard how I was sighing, how miserable I was, and I had no one to comfort me. All my enemies heard, and they were happy at the bad things that befell me. Because it says because you did it, God, right? Again, so God did this, but what that means is, may you bring the day that you called on, that you told us about, and they will be like me. You did this to me, do it to them now. You promised, kind of, right? All right. Tavo chol ra'atam lefanecha v'olel lamo, right? May all their evil come before you, right? And then you should do this to them. In other words, they also sin. Kasher olalta li el kol psha'ai, like you did to me for my sins. Ki rabot anchotai v'libi davai, because my sighs are many and my heart is sick. So it's interesting. So on the one hand, it's like, well, there's just justice. It's just justice that, you're punishing me for my sins. You should punish them for their sins. But the end is because I am so miserable. God, look at me. Look at me. I'm Sion. Look at me. Look at Zion. I am so miserable. Look what you've done to me, right? And you should do it to them. What's interesting is that that I work a lot in Second Temple literature. So there's a similar reaction to the Second Temple burning down in Fourth Ezra. So in Fourth Ezra, they have the character of Ezra who's reacting to the temple's destruction, but really the author is reacting to the second temple's destruction because that's when it's written. And he's like, we got it. We really sinned. But didn't they sin more? Like, it's so great. Like, we sinned, but didn't we have this idea also in the first temple in Eicha, right? And what's interesting is here, on the one hand, there seems to be enough of a distance to say this had happened to us because we sinned. And God acted like an enemy, but it's all wound up with our sin. And at the same time, all that they're asking for is kind of his revenge. They're not even thinking in terms of let us come back, let us rebuild. It's all they can think of is like, they also sinned and they laughed at us. This is a big theme in Eicha in general, and in particular this chapter. I have no one to comfort me, and they're laughing at me. They're only happy at my downfall. And this is of course part of the idea that you think you have alliances with other nations, and then it turns out that no one is on your side, and God isn't on your side, and God isn't on your side, and that all that combined is this source of tremendous pain. So I see Susan Aronoff said, how did when the mistranslation of Betula as virgin set in? It's an understandable translation because Betulot is virginity, right? It's used to mean virginity, Betulot, right? We just can see from the way the word Betula is used that it doesn't refer to just a virgin, because they'll talk about a married Betula, right? So it's not, and not, she's not a virgin, right? So that's how we know. Right. Otherwise, it would make sense for it to mean virgin. We just see that it's used in other things where it's not necessarily referring to a virgin. Is there? I think there's another message here. Let's see. No, that's it. Any other questions or comments?
Miriam,
Yes.
in a manuscript, how can you tell a shin from a sin?
Oh, you can't. The answer is you can't. You
Then
can't.
how do you know it's a sin, not a shin?
Because I think the translations don't like, we have Septuagint, we have Aramaic, and I'm trying to remember now, but I think in general they kind of struggle with the word also. In other words, it seems to be, I'll look at it again, but I think that's why. In other words, it's because they're not translating Shakat. Right? If they were translating Shin Kuf Dalet, but I'll look at it again to make sure, and I'll get back to you on it next week.
Doesn't it depend to some extent on the earliest codices and how they put in
yes. Look, when we learn a Torah text, we're always relying on codices, but they're so late, right? And then we're like, okay, so was this just a mistake? When did it come in? And one of the things we do then is we look at translations. Right, we look at ancient translations, Septuagint. The Aramaic translation is not as early as Septuagint, but like we look at what they were doing with it, and sometimes you all even find like in Qumran, and I don't remember whether we have the Qumran scroll here. I'll go into it more next class because I see people are interested. Sometimes the Qumran, you can see that they're struggling with it, and they're like changing it or something like that because they don't know what to do. So. And with Qumran, I mean, it helps with other things because Qumran writes Malay. In other words, they'll put in a vav for an o, and that will give us sometimes a different reading than we have in the Masoretic text. It gives us more information about the vowels, right? But right, in general, with just a Hebrew manuscript, you're not going to know a shin from sin, right? And it's I think it's because the translations don't say, oh, it's shakat. They don't like to translate it like that. But I'll look into it more to tell you for sure.
So, Miriam, is there any explanation how come sin and shin got the same letter? It's a bit strange.
Oh, it's a simple thing that you do when you, and excuse me for the little bit of kind of heresy here. When you have to take an alphabet that's not written for your language, you make adjustments, right? So if you're taking an alphabet that, let's say Phoenician, whatever it is, it didn't have separate sounds for shin and sin, right? It didn't have, so this is your alphabet. You could either make up another letter, which you might do. In Greek, they made up some letters at the end, they've stuck them at the end of the alphabet, right? But in general, you work with it, right? So shin and sin sounded similar enough, and they're like, hey, we'll just use the same letter. And remember, as my professor Mark Smith used to say, he said the ancients were not German linguists, right? They didn't care. They're like, as long as we know what the word is, it's fine, right? They didn't expect anyone to go back and say, well, I think it's Proto-Semitic. Like they didn't, they were just writing, they just wanted to use the alphabet. So, it's like I don't know if you've ever heard me talk about the evidence for two chets, that Hebrew originally had two different chets, right? And that was completely lost. We use one chet and that's it, right? But there's real reason to believe that we had two different chets that sounded different from each other, right? Like Ugaritic does. There's another theory also that we had two different ions, which is also a different thing. But the evidence for two chets is much stronger, because we have, if you'll allow me, I've said this before, but what a lot of times names keep these sounds longer than anything else. Names tend to be very, very conservative. Names of places, names of people. And when we have transliterated names in Greek into the Septuagint, so Rachel is written with a chi, but Yitzchak is written null, right? There's nothing representing that chet, right? And those two names are great because they're actual words. Rachel is a lamb and Yitzchak is, of course, based on laughter. Well, those two words, we have them in Ugaritic and they use two different chets.
Don't we have two or more chets in Arabic?
Yes, a chet and a het.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. A lot of times they used to use Arabic a lot to understand ancient Hebrew, and they really moved away from that because Arabic is considered very late now. So they're very careful when they use Arabic to try and understand something in ancient Hebrew. But Ugaritic is super, it's the closest thing we've got. It's Northwest Semitic, which is Hebrew is Northwest Semitic. So, I mean, Ugaritic's kind of earlier than biblical Hebrew, but it's the closest thing we have. So when you see two chets like that, and it splits with two words that are parallel to the words that seem to be expressed differently in sounds when transliterated, that's a nice piece of evidence. Anyway. The chet sound in, I don't know in English in Isaac, it's disappeared because in the Septuagint transliteration it disappeared. That's the whole thing. We use the English words that we use for names. They come from the Greek transliteration in the Septuagint. So we say Gaza because in the Septuagint it's Gaza, right? Which is another thing where they think there are two different ions because they'll have one with a null and one with a G. But we have Isaac without a ch or a ch or anything because that's how it's written in Greek. And we have Rachel with a ch because it's written with a chi in Greek. And the idea is that when they did the Septuagint, they were still maintaining a different sound for those two names. And that's why they transliterated it differently. So fascinating stuff, at least to me. Yes.
It is.
I like gospel, yeah.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you for joining me, everyone. And I hope you can join me next week. I'm going to have last week's class up on YouTube tonight. And I think that'll generally be the pattern of about a week's difference between our class and the recording going on.
Thank you.
So, yes. So
Thanks, Miriam.
my pleasure. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Take
Thank
care,
you.
everyone.